Guan presented to Feng. From the cold city wall, I ascend to the plains of Qin, a wanderer with thoughts flying in the wind. Black clouds block the view of a myriad miles. Hunting fires burn from their midst. A long trail of smoke steams into the dark void. The aura of death alone will not disperse. Pieces of ice interlock, stones about to split. The winds crazed, mountains seem to sway. These days, no hearts steadfast as the green pines. How can I, alone, not wither and fade? Okay, so here we have a poem by Guan. This is an author that we haven't encountered before, so let's make a brief introduction about him. So Guan is not mostly known as a poet. He was a very short-lived person, a friend of Han Yu, and therefore a mid-Tang writer. So his career in many aspects is similar to that of Li He, although a little bit more successful. He came from the southern area of Suzhou, tried to pass the examinations when young, was reputedly a person who had difficulties in making friends and contacts, but who was very academic. So he tried to pass the exams, as almost all Tang scholars tried, and he finally succeeded in 792. 792 was a very, very special year, because that was the year when Han Yu passed the examinations, along with a few other notable Tang figures. In fact, the graduates of the 792 examination became known as the Dragons and Tigers list, Long Hubang. In fact, Guan got a better result than Han Yu. He was 5th rank on the list of successful Jianxi graduates. And so he passed the examination, but he wasn't too successful after that in getting appointed to important positions. And shortly afterwards, I mean, he passed in 792. He was dead in 794, just 2 years afterwards, after having served in some minor positions in and out of the capital. His works are pretty limited. There are only 30 surviving poems of his, only 4 of which are really known. He's more famous for his prose. He has 50 texts, a lot of which were written while he was trying to look for patrons and protectors while trying to pass the examinations. So, what else can we say about him? Well, I think that's enough. We can jump into the poem. The biography I've read of him included in the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati by William Nienhauser establishes that he was, as opposed to Han Yu and other of his contemporaries who were very important in the Guan movement, that sought to go back to antiquity and to avoid ornamental excess and the influence of Buddhism and Taoism. Unlike them, he was, it seems, like a person with a broader spectrum of genres, subjects, and of a more eclectic mindset. And you could speculate how the Fugu, the return to antiquity movement, would have developed if Guan had lived longer. As opposed to, Han Yu was notoriously famous for his xenophobic dislike of Buddhism and for being the father of that line of thought that would crystallize in the Neo-Confucianist movement under the Song Dynasty. Anyway, back to Guan. This is a poem of his that he probably wrote, well, he dedicates it to Feng, who was also a fellow Southerner and a fellow graduate, who lived a little bit longer than him. And presumably this poem was written in the winter before their success in the famous 792 examination. Topic of the poem, a very typical Chinese scholar poem. It's a sad, melancholy poem, lamenting contemporary politics and society, a poem in which Li Guan, presents himself as quite pessimistic and as the only or one of the few virtuous people in a time of decline and decadence. One of the characteristics of this poem is its harsh diction, which is reminiscent of the poetry that was introduced by those mid-Tang poets that we've mentioned before, like Han Yu and Meng Jiao, who were mostly prose writers, especially Han Yu, but when writing poetry used a harsher, more direct style and even touched topics that were perceived as undecorous by the conventions. So this poem is set in winter. Remember, seasons are very significant for classical Chinese poetry, and they depict and represent states of mind. That is, the canvas of nature in a painting or in a poem is meant to be a coded symbolism for the psychological state of the poetic persona. So here we have a poem in which the poet is in the capital and goes wandering around the plains of Qin surrounding the capital, and he only sees sights of winter. Winter is the most depressing season in Chinese poetry. I mean, scholar official poetry is usually about melancholy thoughts and sadness, and it even makes spring a sad season. But like winter is clearly the worst season of all. It's the season of death. It's the season in which executions were officially scheduled to take place. It's the season of cold, of ruthlessness, of harshness, of decline. And all this natural background setting is played against the one resisting green pine, which is, of course, the poet himself and perhaps his friends. Let's take a look, as usual, at the poem couplet by couplet. The harsh landscape brings to mind frontier poetry. If you remember some of the frontier poems we've read, they usually depict an alien landscape and put the emphasis on deserts, ice, cold, snow. Harsh, physically tough environment. First couplet. From the cold city wall I ascend to the plains of Qin, a wanderer with thoughts flying in the wind. So, as usual, the first couplet, this is a pentasyllabic poem. I think it's a regulated poem. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No, it's got 10 lines. So no, it's not a regulated poem, but 5 lines. 5 lines, no, 10 lines, 5 characters per line. So it's 5 couplets then. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, not a regulated poem. So in the first couplet usually introduces us, sets us the scene and the time and space in which the action is taking place. So we're clearly in the capital. And the poet is moving outwards. He goes from the cold city wall to the plains of Qin. It's weird that he says ascends, because one would imagine you would get down from the city walls and the plains would be lower, but maybe the plains are rising around Shanghai, and I'm not sure about that. But anyway, cold is the image. From the cold city wall to the plains of Qin, a wanderer with thoughts flying in the wind. Wanderers, remember, wandering around, whether it be for private reasons or public reasons, is always a bad thing to be for a Chinese scholar official, or at least a thing to be lamented. Wandering means being far from home, from family. Remember, Confucian values place family above everything. You should always be with your family if you can. There is a tension between the obligations of serving the ruler as opposed to the obligations of serving your family. Family, if it doesn't take precedence, it's always a reason to complain if you cannot, be with them. And, be serving in faraway places is supposed to be bad because you're far from your family. Dying in a faraway place is terrible because you cannot be buried a priori in your family graveyard with the other members of the clan. So the poem starts with this poetic persona who has descended from the city, is exploring the plain, the winter plain. The coldness of the cold city wall evokes this winter, but successive natural images will hammer in the idea that we are in winter. And the poet is just wandering around. What does he encounter? Second couplet. Black clouds block the view of a myriad miles. Hunting fires burn from their midst. So this is winter. If we didn't know that it was winter because of the cold in line 1, we get the hunting fires in line 4. Winter is the season for hunting, mostly. It's not a season for agriculture. Everything is frozen. It's not a season for harvesting, but it's the season where hunting is accepted as, the thing to do. Black clouds block the view of a myriad miles, as opposed to those poems in which the poet climbs a high tower and gets an expanded view inside and outside. Here the clouds are blocking the view. There is no insight, there is no looking beyond. The clouds form a thick wall that blocks the view. So just like the city wall blocks the city, these black clouds are blocking the view. And where do these black clouds come from? Well, maybe they're dark clouds of winter, but also, they might be the result of the many fires that are on the plain because, lots of people are hunting. It's cold, so they're making fires, and those fires are creating these black smoky clouds that billow up and up and up and block the view. So images of darkness, of not seeing, of small points of light in the middle of a black darkness. Third couplet. A long trail of smoke steams into the dark void. The aura of death alone will not disperse. So remember, winter is the season of death. Trees are leafless, dark, stumps, cold, rain supreme. There might be snow, brown, dark colors, frigidity. Animals go into hibernation, insects die. So the aura of death pervades everything. And, the poet is in consonance. His feelings rhyme with this depressing type of nature. Yeah, there's smoke merging into the dark void, where dark void is, the heavenly vault. But here, the dark void clearly evokes, images of nothingness, of dissolution, perhaps of death. So really depressing landscape and really depressing feelings on the part of the scholar official. Pieces of ice interlock, stones about to split. The wind's crazed, mountains seem to sway. This is a parallelistic couplet. It's very easy to see it's parallelistic in the translation. One thing that happens a lot in some of the poems that I've read is when you have this descriptive element, the description, there seems to be like a zoom in of the camera. Like the first couplets describe, well, the first one describes the background, and then the middle couplets of the poem are generally descriptive, but they tend to go from the more generic view to the more specific. So second couplet, it was clouds and fires. Third couplet was a trail of smoke going up. Fourth couplet, you get specific things that probably are close by or could be touched by the poetic persona. Ice on the rocks, winds apparently shaking the mountains. That is, the imagery becomes more descriptively concrete. And again, it's an imaginary of sad, depressing symbols of winter. You have ice locking together, breaking the stones with its force. And you have, winds that are hurricane-like winds, so strong they seem to be able to knock down mountains. So again, the images, the depressing images of nature, of rocks being broken by the cold, by the ice, and of mountains, firm mountains being shaken from their solidity and stability by strong winds, the tides of change. So implicitly here, the times are a winter for the poetic persona. And probably there's this subtext political message that we're living in a winter of political, social decline. And worthy people like me and my friends are not being recognized and given the power and the respect we deserve, and the positions of power that by our virtuous nature we should be occupying. And we should have passed the examinations already. Only in this time of decline and decadence is not, we don't find our merits recognized. Finally, the last couplet clinches with an allusion to the analects. So, fifth couplet, these days no hearts steadfast as the green pines. How can I alone not wither and fade? In this time of universal decline, how can the poet himself avoid declining? And the reference is to Analects 9:28, a very famous quote by Confucius: "When the year becomes cold, then we know how the pine and the cypress are the last to lose their leaves." This became a very common trope among Confucian scholars, this idea that only when experiencing hardship and bad luck does the virtuous Jianzu, the virtuous man, show his worth. Like, it's easy to be generous and kind and good when life is going your way and you're rich and prosperous and happy. So it's easy to be virtuous when it's easy to be virtuous. But in times of hardship, only the ones that are truly virtuous at heart, only those ones that are really moral above all things, show their true colors. And the metaphor here is the pines, like evergreen trees that, whatever the season, are always green, are always full of leaves. So the poet is saying, a little bit ironically, that he's not sure if he will be able to remain green when everything's so white. So this is Li Guan's poem. I found it interesting. It's a very representative poem of what scholar officials like to write and sing about.